We're going to look at a little bit more complicated problem with solving equations. And again, I want to remind you that when solving equations, we are really doing GEMDAS backwards. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to note that I'm solving. I'm going to write GEMDAS, and I'm going to put the arrow backwards, and I'm going to write solving. Okay, so we're going to go back to our flow chart that we created. And the first question we ask ourselves is, are both sides of the equal simplified? So let's go ahead and write that down. Are both sides of the equal sign simplified? Okay, so let's just look at that. So if I'm going to look at the left side, I see I have d, the quantity d minus 3 in the numerator, divided by 5. There is nothing I can do to simplify that. If I look at the right side, I simply have 6. There is nothing I can do to simplify that. So, are both sides simplified? The answer to that question is yes, they are. Okay, so let's look down, follow our flow chart. So yes, both sides are simplified. So is a variable term being grouped? Let's look at this. Is the variable term, my variable term is d, is it being grouped? And if you remember from a couple videos ago with simplifying expressions, I mentioned that the numerator is one group and the denominator is another group. That division line, that fraction bar, is actually grouping a numerator and a denominator. So the answer is yes, it is. So the answer is yes. We're going to do a couple things on in our equation. So what I want to write here first in our flow chart is I want you to highlight everything being grouped. Okay, that's very important. Highlight everything that is being grouped. So let's look back. What is being grouped? Well, if you recall, what did I do with this particular problem? Notice how I put parentheses in the numerator and the denominator to show that each of those was being grouped separately. So I'm going to group, that's my numerator. I just have 5 in the denominator, so I really do not need to put a parentheses around that. But I'm going to highlight my grouping on the top. So I want you to think of that d minus 3 as one number, because if we knew what the number d was, we could subtract it and then divide. Unfortunately, we don't know what it is, and we're trying to figure it out. Okay, so we is a variable term being grouped. So that's what we're going to write over here in our questions, because I want you to start thinking this way. Is the variable term being grouped? And the answer is yes. It is. It's in the numerator, isn't it? And it has something going on in the numerator. So we're going to treat that yellow thing as one number. So let's go back to our flow chart. So we highlighted everything that is being grouped. So now what are we going to do? We're going to do GEMDAS, and we're going to do it backwards. And we're going to solve for the group or the grouping. Okay? We're going to solve for the grouping. Okay, so that's what we're going to do now. So I'm just looking at this group, and I'm going to ask myself, I'm going to go back and I'm going to use this GEMDAS backwards. So now I'm going to ask myself the first question, which is my AS, is anything being added or subtracted to the grouping? Is anything being added or subtracted to the grouping? So if I'm looking just at this grouping, what do I have? I have my grouping, and then I have a division sign, and then I have 5. So is anything being added or subtracted to that grouping? So this is my grouping. I don't care what's inside of it. And the answer to this is no. Nothing is being added or subtracted to that yellow thing. Okay? So then I'm going to ask myself the next question. Question number 4, which is, well, we talked about adding and subtracting. Now we're going to talk about multiplying and dividing. So is anything being multiplied or subtracted to the grouping? And the answer is yes. We have a divided by 5 here, which is the same as, so I'm going to show you here, this is the same as 1/5 times that grouping. I just want you to start getting in the habit of thinking that way, okay? So yes, I'm going to say this grouping is being divided by 5. So if it's being divided by 5, so I'm going to write group is being divided by 5. So the inverse operation is multiplying. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to multiply this whole number by 5. I want you to notice that 5 is upstairs in the numerator, and I'm stressing that because you guys tend to write it in the wrong place. So I'm going to put that's the same as 5 over 1, which means my 6 is also going to be multiplied by 5 because 5 divided by 1 is the same as 5. So here I have 5 divided by 5. 5 divided by 5 divides out to 1. Notice I wrote a 1 there. So then that leaves me with D minus 3 is equal to 30. Okay, so it looks like I have released myself from the grouping. I've solved for the grouping, and that was what was in the group. Because nothing is being multiplied to it or divided to it, I no longer need parentheses. So let's go back and look at the flow chart. So I solved for the grouping, and my next question that I'm going to ask myself in this flow chart is the grouping alone? Is the grouping alone? Yeah, I got it all alone, right? So the answer is yes, which means now I'm going to do GEMDAS, solving for the variable. So before I get ahead of myself, we're going to write this question here. The next question, number 5, is the grouping alone? And the answer is Yes. So I know we've done a lot of writing here, but this is all the thinking that needs to happen in your head. So it's very important that you write it, because then it's going to help you get it in your head, so it just becomes like breathing. So that means now I'm just going to do GEMDAS, solving for the variable term. So I'm going to go back to GEMDAS and I'm going to ask myself, is anything being added or subtracted? And actually I'm going to write this right here. I'm going to write number 6. Is anything being added or subtracted to the variable? Is anything being added or subtracted to the variable? And the answer is yes. We have a -3 that is being added to my variable, which means I want to unsubtract this 3, okay? So I want to do the inverse of -3, which is +3. Again, be mindful, where am I going to introduce that +3? If I introduced it to the left side of the equals, I must also introduce it to the right side. So that means I have a +3 there. So that means then that my final answer is D equals 33. Again, I want to point out how my equal sign aligns nicely. My D was on the left. I left it on the left. And that is my final answer. So I want you to get in the habit of using GEMDAS for both solving and simplifying. It never goes away. I do not care how hard that problem looks. It can be the messiest problem in the world, but you will always use the order of operations to either solve or simplify.